Okay, so that suggests that where we have these mechanisms. So how does one begin to resolve the microevolutionary picture of gradualist sociobiology from last week and the macro picture of punctuated equilibrium drama and all of that? How do you begin to put the pieces together? Okay, a number of ways that it could be done. Let me just see here. Yes, a number of ways it could be done. One is thinking again about micromutational changes are about changes in the function of pre-existing proteins. Macromutational changes are about the invention of new proteins, new networks, new if-then clauses, all of that serving different functions. Back to the difference in the genome between humans and chimps. When you look at the micro versus the macro differences, for example, in the domain of the immune system, most of the differences between humans and chimps genetically have to do with microevolutionary differences. And that comes down to clinical pictures that you see. Humans are much more resistant to tuberculosis than chimps are. Chimps are much more resistant to malaria than humans are. Nonetheless, it's the basic nuts and bolts of the immune system there. One of these guys has a little bit better of this, one has worse of that. This is within a realm of gradualist change. The genetic differences that explain that are microevolutionary ones. Where are the macroevolutionary differences between humans and chimp genomes? Those are the ones that have to do with development. And those are the ones that amplify differences big time. Get one tiny little difference, and you get an organism that's going to look as different from a chimp as a human does, or the other way around. Some systems, their evolution is much more built, driven by micro changes, some much more than macro. Some of the most interesting macro stuff is going to be developmental blueprints, developmental trajectories. Okay, what else? What else in terms of resolution? There are plenty of fossil histories by now for some line that are complete enough that it is very clear they look like this. And the majority of fossil pedigrees that are that detailed enough support a punctuated model. Nonetheless, there are plenty that are understood with as many time points in here that follow gradualist models. So, evidence for both, nonetheless, mostly punctuated evidence. The biggest problem, though, in debating all of this is it is impossible, for the most part, to see gradualism going on because it's gradual, because it's hard to spot that. It's hard to show whether changes are incremental or changes are rapid, but by now there are a few examples where people have actually been able to observe evolutionary changes in organisms, and ones that can count as fairly rapid. One first example. For reasons I cannot begin to understand, people in Chicago, I don't know if it's in the Chicago Field Museum or the mayor's office or something, have all sorts of carcasses around from rats killed in Chicago in the 1880s. Key to the city, souvenirs, who knows what, Chicago Centennial, but those are around stored someplace, and a few years ago researchers were able to look at the genomes of those beasts compared to rats that are being taken these days off the streets of Chicago, current ones, and showing over the course of a century a lot of the genome has evolved. There are a lot of differences. Over the course of a century, I don't know, what is that, maybe 500,000 generations or so, there has been significant change over that time. Darwin's finches, for those of you Darwin history fans, that started the whole thing. All sorts of different species of finches found in the Galapagos Islands, and people have been studying them for half a century, 3/4 of a century. Gene distributions are changing. Gene distributions for traits like the size of your bill, and thus what kind of food you could break into in response to environmental shifting there. That is being documented. That's going on. What else? Another one that is really interesting and important and critical for lots of us, which is the evolution of resistance to diabetes. This is a very interesting phenomenon. Diabetes comes in two forms. Juvenile onset diabetes, that's the one where you need insulin. The diabetes that's instead becoming an epidemic is adult onset diabetes, which is when you have a body which is all built out of like lean hominid history to store away lots of calories and all of that, and you throw in a westernized diet and you get the increasing westernized problem of obesity, and you then wind up getting diabetes. For our purposes right now, it doesn't matter what diabetes looks like. The main thing is it is driven by food excesses in westernized diets. So there's been a whole literature by now of people studying populations that have had rapid shifts from traditional diets to westernized diets. A lot of Pacific Islanders have been studied, all sorts of other populations. The group that is like the iconic one to study is a Native American group in Arizona called the Pima Indians. And what's very convenient about them is about half of them live in the United States and about half in Mexico. And there has been very rapid changes in diet in the American side, less so in the Mexican one, far more traditional. And one of the things that soon emerged once westernized, sort of typical processed food became the predominant food eaten by people in the Arizona side is like 90% diabetes rates by the time you're 30 years old. The exact same thing in some of the Pacific Islands that have been studied, in Nauru and Samoa and some of these other places, astronomically high rates of diabetes. Another population where it's been studied are populations of Jews who were living in Yemen and who, I think in the 60s or 70s, moved to Israel, switching from a very traditional diet to a very westernized one. Diabetes rates absolutely through the roof. What that's doing very quickly was killing off all sorts of folks very early in their reproductive life history periods. Suddenly you got the people who are most vulnerable to diabetes. When suddenly given a westernized diet, they're leaving fewer copies of their genes. And it's been in the last decade or so, some of the Pacific Island populations that have been studied, the diabetes rates are beginning to go down. In other words, there has been the selection that went into Western European populations, I don't know, a century ago or so, which is the folks who have the most efficient metabolisms and can store away all of those dozens of Hershey bars effortlessly. They're dead, and they died before they left copies of their genes. You are now selecting for human populations that have sloppier metabolisms, and this is within the course of a century.